Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're in the middle of a series called Hall of Faith, looking at some Old Testament men and women who showed their faith. This is the sixth installment of this series, and this is Abraham and Sarah part 2. So it'd be good to catch last week's Abraham and Sarah, where we began talking about them. This time will be still in Hebrews 11 and Genesis 16 through 18. So last time, we looked at Abraham and Sarah, focusing on their lives of faith. We looked at Genesis 12 and Acts 2, which was Stephen's testimony. Stephen, the first martyr in the New Testament. Acts 2, to get the story of Abraham and Sarah's initial example of being confident and trusting in God. So this example is a focus of the writer of Hebrews. Recall that in chapter 11 is where he brings up many of the ancients, as he called them, or Old Testament people. Let's reread Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10. This is about Abraham and Sarah, what we discussed last week. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, that'd be his son and his grandson, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham is the subject here, but I contend that it wouldn't have happened without the faith of Sarah too. And I call this, what we talked about last week, this is a good example of faith when you don't know where God's taking you. That was the case for Abraham and Sarah. Today we're going to continue looking at the story of Abraham and Sarah at a second time in their lives where faith was shown. This is a good example of faith when you don't know how God's will be accomplished. So in verse 11 of Hebrews chapter 11, we read this: By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Now I got to tell you, I have a lot of confidence in the New American Version translation of the Bible, the NIV, but I think they missed the boat here. And I can't blame them because there's the phrase, become a father, was not gender specific, but they make it gender specific. NIV is the only one who begins by faith, Abraham. And it's sad because the writer introduces the first heroine instead of hero of faith. So I'm going to read these two verses from the New American Standard Translation. And you can find it similar in other translations. This is the same verses. By faith, Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Sarah's faith in God, being faithful, allowed her to overlook physical limitations. They had to wait 25 years for the fulfillment of the promise. So who would blame her if she wanted to give up? It seems she did not give up, but she did come up with a creative solution. We read that in Genesis chapter 16. Starting in the first verse. Now Sarai, now that was Sarah's name before God changed it. Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai had said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. And that's how Ishmael, the oldest son of Abraham, came to be. So this was with good intentions, I believe, from Sarah and from Abraham. They wanted God's plan to go forth, but that was not God's plan. God speaks to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. God has given them their new names of Abraham and Sarah now. This is God speaking. Genesis 17, verse 16. I will bless her, that would be Sarah, and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. That was God's plan, that Sarah would be the mother of the first descendant of the many descendants, Isaac being the first. Isaac's son Jacob then taking it, continuing on all the way to Jesus Christ. So you got to give Sarah credit for coming up with a solution. Strictly speaking, if you think about it, the promise was that Abraham would have descendants. It didn't say that Abraham and Sarah would have descendants. And so by having Hagar conceive, Abraham was the father, so that would be a descendant. But that wasn't God's plan. I presume God saw her intentions were good. So she had faith in the promise that God had given. So I think this is a good example of how God looks at the heart, the attitude, the faith of his children, even when they are in error. Sarah had another opportunity to be turned into salt or hit with a lightning bolt when she laughed at what the Lord was saying. And then this story, God has a sense of humor too. And this happened, the Lord appearing as three men pays a visit to Abraham and Sarah. It was the Lord and two angels pay a visit to Abraham and Sarah. Genesis chapter 18, verse 9. And Abraham, I didn't give you that, did I? Where is your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he said. Then the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? It's a good thing to always remember. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. Okay, this is double trouble for Sarah because she was laughing at God and lying too. But God, again, must have seen her faith and her trust and maybe appreciated her sense of humor because sure enough, Sarah survived laughing at the Lord, and Isaac was born the next year, just as it was predicted, and the descendants did begin. All right. So that's Sarah's faith. It's time to get back to Hebrews chapter 11. The writer, that's what we had read already. By faith, Sarah herself received ability to conceive, and even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. The writer does have more to say about the faith of Abraham, and we're going to get into that next week. But in the middle of writing about Abraham's faith, This is the second event. The first was Abraham beginning his journey, and then they're conceiving Isaac. In the middle of writing about Abraham's faith, the writer kind of goes into a kind of a summary of the ancients or the Old Testament characters and their faith. So after rereading this, it goes on. So I read the first part. Therefore there was born, in verse 12, even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Then the writer says, people who say such things... I don't have 13 through 16. I'm going to read that. All these people were still living by faith when they died. This is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, which isn't shown here. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. So these verses do apply to Abraham and Sarah, but they also apply to Abel and Enoch and Noah, who we already studied. And they also apply to the Old Testament people the writer brings up later. These verses would have a good meaning to the reader of Hebrews, the readers at that time, about not receiving the things promised. And they do apply to us too. Let's read on. There in verse 14. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So each of these verses is like a principle we can apply to our walk with God, and the Hebrew reader could apply it to their walk with God. I want to look at that a little bit closer here. First one I say is looking beyond. This is a principle, looking beyond. From verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. So looking beyond. To me, this is the ability to hope beyond the present situation. So Abraham and Sarah didn't receive the promise of possessing their land, but they also didn't receive the bigger promise, redemption. We're fortunate because we've been redeemed through Jesus Christ. But as we're facing the struggles here on earth, we can only look forward to the promises of eternity. We are not in eternity at this moment. As Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. So just like Abraham and Sarah were aliens and strangers on earth, we are too. The second principle would be looking for. From verse 14, people who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. The such things said by Abraham and Sarah are that they were aliens and strangers. They were looking for a real home. We can work hard making our home here, or we can concentrate on eternal pursuits here. And the latter is the better way to go. We can concentrate on eternal pursuits, but we do it here. And then we leave it behind, leaving it behind as a principle. In verse 15, if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. There was nothing physically keeping Abraham and Sarah from returning. They never did because they looked beyond and were looking for. That can be a driving force for us too. Yeah, stuff can get in the way, and And there are also things we have to say goodbye to, but it's worth it. And then lastly, we have the principle of longing for, as said in verse 16. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So for Abraham and Sarah, longing for a better country, or the Greek for that phrase, longing for, to stretch out after, to yearn after. That's what Abraham and Sarah were doing. They were longing for a better country. We can yearn after something more enduring than anything we could have here. That's what we are longing for. We are longing for what can expect in eternity. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop. We're going to continue looking at Abraham next time, starting with Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. So in the meantime, take care, and may the Lord be with you.